That's it, boys. Climb those mountains and bring that statue down. Wait, no? What are you doing? Undead Knights is an action game where you take control of an army of zombies and go on a murderous rampage on the way to killing a magic tree. It was developed by Now Productions in conjunction with Team Tachyon, who are famous for absolutely nothing. The game was released exclusively on the PSP, with its initial American and Japanese releases in late 2009. That's a curious date, since that was also the year in which the publisher, Tecmo, merged with Koei to become Koei Tecmo, and Undead Knights might as well be a Musou game in hiding. Once upon a time, the aging King Gladys married a young woman named Fatima, and he quickly became her biggest simp. Romulus Blood, head of the House of Blood and one of the king's most loyal knights, wasn't happy with his lord's relationship, for he put Fatima's whims above all else rather than the wishes of his people. In response, the king made a decision that would age very poorly by chapter 19. Romulus's brother, Remus, was to marry Sylvia, the king's daughter. As they rode together to the castle to announce their marriage, the king's army ambushed them and slaughtered their entire family. This incident became known as the Marriage of Blood. In his last breath, a demonic entity offered Romulus a pact that would grant the three a second life, and let them exact revenge on the treacherous king. Romulus, Remus, and Sylvia were reborn as undead knights, with the power to turn their enemies into zombie slaves that would fight and die again at their command. And so, the trio goes on a happy journey of vengeance against the king, his kingdom, and Fatima. Everything's gonna burn, motherfucker! At the start, it seems like it's just a cute little revenge story, but it's apparent that someone on the development team was having fun with it. It's very schlocky and immature, with gratuitous swearing and a medieval setting that sprinkles a dose of fantasy on top of a grimy worldview. It's raw and filtered edge, and I'm happy to cut myself on it. Predictably, the three characters realize at the end that they are being manipulated by literally Satan and decide to stop following its commands, and to atone for the atrocities they committed over the course of the game. And yes, that invocation of Roman mythology does have a purpose. Vaguely. But the king and his lackeys absolutely deserve it, and that's why killing them all is cathartic, rather than a self-reflective journey about our sins. Everyone from the kingdom is an asshole in some way or another, from the crazy scientists to the thirsty as balls clergymen. In the land of the corrupt and immoral, the demonic berserker who unleashes F-bombs is king. And of course, some of the villains talk about how you're no better than them and how they're going to create a perfect world where humans live forever and are always happy. Then the player just tells them to shut up moments before dropping a message saying you received the title "Tiny's my bitch." Dog bless this game. This is together with your army of goons being utilized in increasingly unusual manners, like sticking cannons into their heads and smashing a gate with them, or just friggin' bonking each other into a giant statue. Absurdity that launches my sides into the far reaches of Andromeda. The game is even cartoonishly cruel at points, with situations where the zombies get crushed or thrown into some deadly apparatus. It's a sick kind of satisfaction, but a satisfaction nonetheless. On the subject of its highbrow artistic merits, the game was apparently released in America before Japan, which is interesting and recontextualizes what I thought about the soundtrack. No, not this one. I mean this one. For reasons unknown, the USA got a different soundtrack from the Japan and Europe releases, with death metal taking the place of the orchestral score used by the others. Which in a way is pretty fitting, though I think the orchestral tracks fit just as well due to the game's frequent usage of mythological and religious symbolism to make itself look epic and dramatic. More importantly though, the USA version gets more blood splatters and zombie dismemberment, something that I wasn't aware of until I finished recording an entire playthrough on the European version, because that's what I was familiar with. The bungling of a lifetime. Every strike paints the ground red, and whenever anyone, including the player, hits a zombie, there's a decent chance that their head or one of their limbs flies off, and deadly obstacles end up with them sliced to pieces, instead of rigor mortising on the floor. It's beautiful. Though I can't imagine it does any favors to the game's already unstable performance on real hardware. Runs great on an emulator, but not so much on an actual PSP, which you can totally tell from this amazing off-screen footage. It targets 60 FPS, but it locks down to 30 whenever there's more than 1 or 2 enemies on screen, so basically always, and in the worst case scenarios it drops even further down to the teens. Oh, and back in 2009, Sony launched the PSP Go, which does not have a disk drive. To go with it, a large amount of titles were made available for digital download, and what was supposed to be a demo for Undead Nights was instead the full game. Good going, you guys! The core of the gameplay involves moving from one area to the next while smashing heads and birthing zombies. You're given an objective, like killing X or opening Y, and you have to complete that using your brawl and your brains. You can play as any of the 3 protagonists, but fundamentally their playstyles are very similar. Romulus is the big guy with the heavy armor, Remus is more fragile but has much faster attacks, and Sylvia lies somewhere in the middle with her wide sweeping slashes. Each one shares the basic framework of light attacks, heavy attacks, and combos executed by mixing the two, and they all have the exact same commanding capabilities and other upgrades. The story is also the same regardless of the character, just with a handful of dialogue lines being altered. At the end of each stage, you get rated based on how well you did, and that rank determines the amount of upgrade points you get, which can be spent to unlock health and damage upgrades along with new moves. Typical action game stuff. You're free to replay older stages, so grind away if you need a helping hand. And if you're willing to dump your pride, there's even a few upgrades that basically serve as cheats, granting you big bonuses but reducing your final score. It's a blend of Dynasty Warriors and Overlord, not that one, where half of the action revolves around combat, and the other half is about using necromancy to clear obstacles. The game's core mechanic is the zombie boys, who fight alongside the player and are required to overcome many obstacles. Spawning them is done by grabbing enemies and fully depleting their health, but of course it's not so simple that you can just grab anyone and be done with it. Enemies will automatically escape after a few seconds, so ideally you should damage them before going for a grab. Inflict enough pain and they will glow red, at which point you can perform a perfect grab to instantly convert them. You can cancel regular attacks into grabs, so you can do it right the moment the enemy is vulnerable. Perfect grabs also slightly recover your health and your Infernal Wrath gauge, which lets you unleash a powerful attack when it's full. Any enemies killed by this attack will immediately turn into zombies, so it's pretty useful when you're low on heads but high on soon-to-be corpses. You can control up to 10 zombies at once, and giving them orders is as simple as aiming at your target and letting them do whatever they are supposed to. But your walking corpses are very versatile and expendable tools, and can also be grabbed and utilized in multiple ways. You can throw them at enemies to stun them, or use them as meat shields to block projectiles, or even sacrifice them by smashing their bodies into the ground for a powerful attack. Zombies will also latch onto regular enemies out of their own volition, and striking while they are being grabbed deals massive damage. This is especially useful against large enemies, which can be stunned and left open to attacks by throwing enough zombies at them. It should be no surprise, however, that this game is pretty repetitive, partially due to its low budget and the structure of the gameplay. The developers certainly tried to keep things fresh with new types of enemies and challenges, for better or for worse. And it's cool that each section of the campaign has different variants of the basic enemies. There are also different zombie types, but aside from the giant ones, the apparent impact on gameplay is practically null, and if you're like me, you won't even notice. One major gripe I have with the gameplay is that giving orders isn't as responsive as it should have been. While it makes sense that the zombies are completely brain dead, the playability suffers when you're trying to get enough of them to trigger something, but most are busy doing whatever and take too long to get there. The player also needs to always have enemies to turn into zombies, so basic grunts also spawn infinitely. This means that you're going to have some pesky annoyances interrupting you while you're on your knees begging your squad of rotten meat sticks to please stop humping that shield and get that damned gate open. Orders just getting cancelled the moment you leave the aiming mode is just a bizarre decision in general, since it means you can't multitask by telling your zombies to do something while you're occupied elsewhere. On top of that, the game's core ideas are fighting against themselves. Undead Knights wants to sell you a power fantasy of coming back from the dead as a total badass, but it also has to give you a reason to use the zombie mechanics. And that reason is making the player's attacks deal pitiful amounts of damage against regular enemies. Even with fully upgraded damage, basic foot soldiers still won't die unless you give them several good smacks. Again, this was done presumably because the player needs to always have fodder to turn into zombies, and if they died in a hit or two, then you wouldn't even have the chance to convert them. But it also has the knockdown effect of making gameplay extra repetitive, because instead of using all the attacks at your disposal, you mostly just do 1 or 2 hits from your basic combo and then grab your enemies when they turn red, which kills them instantly and spawns another zombie. The gameplay also slowly becomes less fun and more frustrating with every mission, as it attempts to add variety with more gimmicky enemies, and by the last chapter it devolves into mechanical exploitation. Enemies like the spearmen and the knights can just shrug off your attacks and eat through your fully upgraded health bar like it was nothing. In fact, the latter can somehow do a 180 while charging towards your unprotected posterior at 5,000 miles per hour. Bosses aren't much better, with some that seem like they were deliberately designed so that the player has to exploit the mechanics in the most unsatisfying ways. It's not gameplay, it's lame play. One example is Francesca, who face tanks anything you throw at her, takes an absurd amount of punishment, and has fast attacks that track you from a distance. I'm pretty sure you can't beat her without either letting her get stuck on obstacles or repeatedly stun walking her with zombie smashing. This is all made worse by the lack of a manual lock-on, so you can keep important enemies on screen at all times. And again, I have to bring up that part about original hardware. Remember that the PSP only has one analog stick, so to rotate the camera you have to use the D-pad, which is awkward. You can quickly readjust yourself using the L trigger, but that's it. This is another case where emulating the game helps solve some of its limitations, since you can assign the D-pad to a controller's right analog stick to easily adjust the camera. Ultimately, I'm fond of the game, but would I recommend actually going out and playing Undead Nights? Probably not. For most people, the novelty would wear thin after a while, and the gameplay lacks the refinement and depth to last the 7 hours it takes to beat the campaign on normal difficulty. But the concept behind it is certainly neat, and would be nice to see it revisited one day, with a bigger scope, bigger hardware, and a bigger budget. In 2009, many companies were still transitioning to the more complex and more expensive HD era, so systems like the PSP allowed publishers and developers to make experimental titles with less financial risk. Titles like these. Because what well-adjusted member of society hasn't wished to go on a murderous rampage of vengeance at least once in their lives?